Welcome to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. And today I'm joined, as always, by Alex. And we also have a special guest, like usual. Aaron Francis is here with us today.
How you doing, Aaron?
Hey, I'm doing great. This is very exciting. I think this may be one of my first ever front end focused podcasts. So I'm excited and a little bit nervous. I think it's going to be fun.
Oh, I'm more than sure. I mean, all our guests said it was fun so far. Of course, on the record.
Yep.
And off the record too.
We'll promise to be nice to you. So,
100%.
I appreciate that.
I mean, now that we're no strangers on the internet anymore, we see each other. No negative comments, only constructive criticism, feedback, and yeah, we'll want to talk about a lot of things. I think a lot of people listening or watching the podcast on YouTube might know you already, but for everybody who might not be aware, maybe can you give a little introduction around yourself, what you're doing, and what where people might know you from?
Yeah, totally. So I am, I guess by trade, a Laravel developer, have been for quite some time. And I have recently, me and a friend, Steve, have recently started our own company. And what we do is we offer educational material. And so we've started with a course on SQLite and a course on Postgres. I used to work at a MySQL database company, and then I came out of there and was like, oh, there are other databases. I can finally talk about them. And so we explored some of those other databases. But historically, I've been primarily a backend developer for, a few decades now. I was one of those that started when I was quite young. And so that has kind of been where I've been the whole time. And PHP has been my preferred language of choice. And then Laravel came along and cemented that forever. I love Laravel very much. And so, yeah, I do a little bit of writing on my blog, YouTube videos, a whole lot of tweeting, too much tweeting. And so if anyone has seen me from anywhere, it's probably one of those places.
Yeah, perfect. Lovely. And so you mentioned you got into PHP backend programming and also dabbled a bit into front end here and there. But maybe to start with, how did you get in programming after all? Because from what I recall, you didn't say, hey, I want to do a computer science degree and get all into it. So there's a bit of a story there. Yeah.
So I started programming when I was probably, 11, 12, 13, something like that. And my dad, up until he, retired a few years ago, was a database administrator. And so he was a SQL Server DBA my entire life. And so I started out PHP, MAMP stack, LAMP stack, whatever. I started out with that, PHP and MySQL, and I always had a DBA nearby to help me understand, what was going on. And so then I went to college and I was like, well, I don't know if I want to be a programmer. Let me study accounting for 5 years. And so I did. I got my master's degree in accounting, went and worked as a CPA or I guess chartered accountant maybe in Europe or certified professional or public accountant here in the States. Did that for 1 year at a company called Ernst & Young. And I was doing other people's taxes. And I just realized doing other people's taxes is not very fun. Imagine doing your own taxes, but worse. It's like, and that's your entire job all day, every day. So that was no fun. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to take this thing that has always been a hobby and try to make it like my profession. And so I left Ernst & Young, and I had been, working on side projects and blogging. And that was how I got my first big boy programming job. Was somebody found my blog and was like, hey, can you help us with this thing that you just wrote about? And that's kind of been my entire story, is just do stuff and put it out there and see what happens. It has worked well so far.
Yeah, it seems like writing and just sharing your thoughts seems to, it has all sorts of benefits, from forces you to actually understand the stuff better, but then also people can see that. And even if it's like one blog post can get you a job.
Yep.
That's pretty sweet.
And it's the most esoteric stuff. I remember the blog post that got me that job. I think it was titled Automating Yii, YII. It's an old PHP framework. Yeah. Automating Yii migrations on Heroku. That was the blog post. And the reason I wrote that is because I had just done that. I had just figured out how to automate Yii migrations on Heroku. And I just wrote it down and put it on, aaronfrancis.com. It was, not on Medium, not on dev.to. It was just I have this little site, I'll put it up. And I got an email, months later that was like, hey, we're, running Yii on Heroku. Are you available for consulting? I was like, what is going on here? And that was it. I was off to the races.
Perfect. And I think like this is like we say that in some episodes, especially when we talk about like creating content, but for everybody out there, it's like, okay, just write down what you accomplished. It can be in a side project where just like, hey, I did this. I couldn't find any resource or any like comprehensive things. Just like, okay, write it together. And this is like, you already did that. You're an expert in what you do because it worked. You did it. There might be other approaches. You get in contact with people who might try the same, or find a job, get hired, or starting your own things. And this is so incredible. Also, like getting the feedback of people to then either improve, I don't know, a certain workflow or technique, or just saying, hey, there's another perspective.
I think there's a big fear of people when they think, oh, I'm going to put out content, I'm going to write, I'm going to make a video or something. And the fear is that they have to be the world's foremost expert on it. And I think like if you change the way that you frame the content that you're creating, instead of I am the expert and here's how you should do it, and you change it to I just did this and here's how I did it, it's just so much easier. The world just like nobody can argue with the fact that is how you did it, right?
It's
Some
true.
people may say like the way you did it, there's a better way. But if you go out there and you say, I'm the expert and here's how you should do it, people just want to fight on the internet. But if you go out there and you say, hey, I had this problem, here's my solution, here are the trade-offs, what do you think? People are like, hey, you did that. I can't argue with that. And it just lowers that pressure quite a bit.
Totally agree.
I think that's a really good tip.
I also think that fits in something you said at your talk at Laracon EU in Amsterdam, because you said that one of like almost your last slides, you said like, I'm not qualified. Where you basically also said, okay, this like you didn't have a degree in computer science and whatsoever, but you stuck with the problem, you worked into that, and everybody else, if like, hey, don't be afraid of like writing open source code or do something. Go for it, stick with a problem, try things out. You don't need any permission. You can just go for it and don't need any qualifications, so to say, to do that.
Yeah, I think, so that was like my last slide just said, I'm not qualified. And it was meant to be like an encouragement to other people, because I think a lot of times people will sit on the sidelines and like listen to podcasts or watch people talk on stage and think, wow, those people are really qualified to be doing what they're doing, and I could never, ever get there. And I think the open secret, I don't think anybody's like hiding knowledge. The open secret is everybody that's on stage, on a podcast, making open source, running a software company, for goodness sakes, they just got there by like sticking with it. And, some people, of course, have like really, really intense formal training, and that's awesome. But I don't. And I don't like, nobody said, hey, Aaron, you can create an open source project that combines Vue and Vite and Laravel, and I think you're the perfect person to do it. Nobody said that. I was just sitting quietly in my room and thinking, I wonder if that's possible. And I just didn't stop. And so that's the encouragement that I was hoping to give, is like, hey, everyone that's listening, I'm literally just like you. The only reason that like I was allowed to come up here on the stage today is I thought there was a problem and I just kept digging until I got to the very bottom. And that's it. And it works. And so
And
that's
then you
my
put
hope
it out in the world.
Yes, that is very important.
Yeah.
I did put it out and I did publish the thing. I think that's another place, that's a good point, where people get hung up, is they do it and then they sit on it forever because they're scared. And I get it. It's terrifying. Like we can talk about Reddit later. It's terrifying. But like, you just like, you owe it to yourself, if you're going to do all this work, to put it out there and like reap the rewards of that, whether that's, friends or notoriety or like a job or coming on podcasts. Like, you will get like good things will happen. Also, people will be upset, but that doesn't matter. And so, yeah, that was my charge to people, is you also can do this.
Yeah, I tried to share about the imposter syndrome that I have felt very strongly, and I still do to some degree. And it's always like, it gets quieter once I've gotten some confidence and I've gotten feedback in a particular area. But I remember the first several years of me working as a software developer, my manager we had like this weekly one-on-one, and it was never like, oh, here are my career aspirations and stuff like that. It was like mostly a therapy session of him reassuring me that, yeah, you're doing a good job, you're contributing. We still want you here. Like, it's like I needed that weekly dose of reassurance that I was all right. And like, that was so helpful. And if you can get that, then that's amazing. But yeah, it's hard.
It's hard. Sounds like a good manager.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Just want to say the same.
definitely.
Like
Yeah.
friends, managers, like also in open source, as someone had never had like a formal, let's say, manager in that way. Like I learned from so many people in open source, and also them reassuring, hey, yeah, that's great. Or of constructive criticism, like, okay, good start. Oh, maybe how about that? You have like not maybe considered this angle. That's super helpful. You grow with that a lot. And then I think like, yeah, reaping the rewards of saying, okay, things get merged, things that you publish, people use it, people in the end say like, hey, thanks to what you did, I don't know, I could solve a problem at work, I could finish my SaaS and launch and whatsoever. Like these are like so amazing feelings. And then I think this is really where you feel the impact that you can really make, when like people are saying, hey, great video, or like, hey, great content, amazing, but like actually it's like real life stories where like people come say, hey, thanks to you, I don't know, I could get a better job and actually, I don't know, could fulfill that dream of mine, or this, that, or I started because of public speaking and get into that. And look, here we are now sharing a stage. So that's, yeah, that's all pretty amazing. On the other hand, of course, we have the negative parts as well. But we'll definitely circle back to that. I already mentioned that you created an open source project out there that combines Laravel, Vue, and it's called Fusion. So maybe for everybody who hasn't heard about it yet, even though it probably is in the podcast title, or maybe that's why, like, hey, that sounds interesting. How does that fuse all these things together, and what is it actually?
Yeah, so it's a little bit wacky, and so it will be, by the time y'all are listening to this, it will be out. It's free. It's open source. I would love your feedback, especially if you're primarily a front end person, because I'm primarily a back end person. So I'd love that other perspective. But the pitch for Fusion is that it is the, in my opinion, best way to combine your batteries included Laravel backend with your modern JavaScript front end. And so the story there is, right now, I think the best story for that is Inertia. And Inertia is wonderful. And in fact, Fusion relies on Inertia. And so Inertia is that little bit of glue between, actually a lot of backends and a lot of different front ends. It has like Rails, Phoenix, Laravel, a bunch of different backends. Inertia sits between the two. But with Inertia, it's still very manual, the way that you get data down into your front end. There's no story to get to execute actions on the back end. And so once you get the data down, you're just in front end land, and you have to write, your API endpoints and your fetch calls, your Axios calls, whatever, to get that behavior back and to do something on the back end. And you're just kind of in that manual place again. And that's been totally fine. But I think in the JavaScript communities, we've seen a lot of very interesting advancements in terms of like bringing the front and back ends closer together. So server components, server actions, all of these things that all of these different JavaScript communities are doing, that's like, hey, you've got a function on the back end, you can call it from the front end. We'll handle the rest. It's like, wow, that's actually kind of nice. I have some qualms with the way that like React server components work, and that you don't know where anything is running ever. And that makes my old head hurt, because I'm like, I kind of like to know what's front end and what's back end. But in principle, it seems really nice, because you can kind of just talk across this barrier. And so that's what Fusion aims to do for Laravel. What it currently does is it allows you to write PHP code in your Vue single file component. You've got your Vue single file component, you've got your template, you've got your script setup, whatever. And then you can write literally a PHP block, and you can write PHP code in that block. And what that will do is that will define what state should be passed down to the front end. It will also define what actions are available to be called from the front end. And then that's it. Like, the magic is, we can talk about it, but it's in Vite, and it will like take the PHP, do a bunch of inspection on it, figure out what data is going to be available on the front end, and then inject a bunch of information into your compiling single file component, so that your Vue component knows what data is available on the front end. And so then you're left in this position where you don't really have to define routes, because we can do file-based routing with Fusion. You don't have to define routes. You don't have to define controllers. You don't have to define props. You don't have to define API endpoints or fetch calls or anything like that. It's all just there for you to use. And so the hope is that it like brings these two world-class solutions in Vue and Laravel and brings them much closer together and allows you to, in the same way that Tailwind kind of allows you to stay in a certain context where you're like, I'm not switching back and forth between the CSS file and the HTML file or whatever. Fusion, the idea for Fusion is it allows you to stay in that context. And so a lot of people cried single responsibility. And my point of view is like, it allows you to stay in one context. Now, how it actually works is the PHP solely runs on the back end. The JavaScript solely runs on the front end. There is an entire network in the middle. It's like everybody is separate. We just happen to be writing it in a place where you can maintain context for like the entirety of the thing that you're doing, which is what is the data that's going to come down and what are the actions that are going to come back. And that entire life cycle is right there in one file. And I think that's really productive.
So it's like literally end to end in a single component.
Yes, exactly.
Perfect. And that means you basically then write a Vue component with template and style if you don't use Tailwind, and then a PHP block, and the script setup block can also coexist with all of that to run in the front end. Interesting.
Yep. It can coexist. It can coexist with script setup. It can coexist with script with options API with a setup method, which I think is. I don't know how common that is. I don't ever really use that.
Luckily, not that common anymore. But,
It can also coexist with no script tag at all. And so those are the 4 possibilities that we've allowed for. So that, because I'm not a dummy, I understand that like once the data comes down, there's still JavaScript stuff to do on the front end. Like it's not like, oh, I just use it in my template and then I just send everything to the back end. It's like, no, the reason we're using these modern JavaScript front ends is for this rich interactivity, this high client side interaction, that kind of stuff. And so to just say like, you can send your data down and use it in a template, but you can't write JavaScript. It's like, well, that's kind of totally missing the point, isn't it? And so we do inject all the Fusion stuff into whatever type of Vue single file component you're working on.
So I'm not a PHP person. I've written like a tiny amount. So I'm trying to understand like what kinds of things would you write your entire backend using this? Or do you think it's more suited for like smaller mutations, or are you putting like your entire backend logic and everything in these tags?
So that's a great question. And that was one of the well-founded criticisms that came up on Reddit and YouTube was like, these files are going to be, 6,000 lines long. I'm like, yeah, okay, that is a great point. My opinion, and we'll see how it kind of shakes out once the community gets a hold of it, but my opinion is the PHP that you write in your Vue single file component should basically just handle the HTTP layer. And so there's a common pattern in Laravel these days called actions. And really what they are is they're just invocable PHP classes. And so you might have an action that is like publish podcast. And what you do is at the HTTP layer, you take all of the user's input, maybe you validate it, maybe you sanitize it, and then you hand it off to publish podcast action. And that's where kind of like your business logic lives. And that allows you to decouple it from the input layer. And sometimes the input layer is the CLI. Sometimes it's a user action. Sometimes it's a webhook. Sometimes it's an import and, an overnight cron, sometimes whatever. And so factoring all of that out into kind of like a standalone plain PHP class that like defines what input it should receive, that to me, I think is going to be the best method for handling that. And so the PHP block in your single file component will handle like taking all the input in from the front end and then routing it off to the right place or dispatching a job or doing something like that. But in terms of like, I need to write my billing logic in a Vue single file component, I think that's a bad idea. I hope people don't do that, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. But I think it's going to be basically the translation layer from HTTP to your sprawling Laravel backend that runs the whole world. That's kind of my vision for it.
So a bit like if you say you have a controller, of course, it also shouldn't be like, 5,000 lines long.
Totally. Thinking of these as controllers is a very, very good analogy. And so then you're left with, what do we do? Thin controllers, fat models? Like you could do thin controllers. I think that is the right way to go. You can do fat models. I have no opinion on that. You could also do these service classes, these actions, these handlers, queued jobs, whatever. But I do think thin controllers and thinking of the PHP block in your SFC is a controller, I think that's the right paradigm.
I mean, in the end, if you would have it like, let's say, in separate files, then you'd also say, okay, I do a request, and that request would hit a controller. And in a way, you more or less move that code from the controller in an extra file, just in your component to say, hey, this is tightly coupled. Lovely.
Yeah, exactly.
I wonder, how does that work under the hood? Because now you have that PHP part that will be then, of course, like parsed out, I guess, for like a Vite job. And then do you have still like an API route for each component that's created, or how is it like generated?
So you want to get nerdy, huh?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I'm here for.
Yes. Okay. So here's how it works. So we've already covered that you're writing your PHP in your single file component. Then what happens is Vite, picks it up and it runs it through this entirely complicated pipeline that I really don't fully understand. This is my first experience with Vite ever. Vite is amazing. I don't know what I've been doing. I've just been using Vite. I've never actually cracked open the hood. It's incredible. So crack open the hood and you realize, oh, you can write your own Vite plugins. That's interesting. What happens next? So I wrote a Vite plugin that works before Vue's plugin, and it pulls that PHP block out. And in the process of pulling it out, what it does is it takes that user's PHP, or developer, we'll call them the user's PHP that they have written, and it takes the content and passes it off to a Laravel command. So in this Vite plugin, it spawns a PHP process and hands all the PHP code off to a Laravel command that ships with Fusion. And the reason that I do that is because the ability to parse PHP in PHP is pretty good. Trying to do all of that in JavaScript would be somewhat difficult. And so I hand off all the raw code to a PHP command, and then we parse it and we walk the abstract syntax tree. And so because we're able to do that, this is a situation that PHP developers have never been in, which is a build step for PHP. That's not something we have ever done. PHP is like, invent the universe on every request and destroy it. You're done. Game over. Like, you don't have to run a pipeline. That's it. So it's not like Ruby where you have to like start up this long running server. PHP is just like stateless, do whatever you want, have fun. But now we're in this situation where we're walking this abstract syntax tree of PHP that the user has written. And in that process, we're looking for stuff. One of the things we're looking for is, hey, did they define any props? Did they say in their PHP, this should be available on the front end? And a way that you can do that is with a little prop function, or you can set it to a public class property. Whenever we're walking that AST and we see, hey, they declared one way or another, this should go to the front end, we kind of write it down. We're like, hey, I should write that one down. We're going to hang on to that one. And then when we're all done, we have all the information about the props that they defined and the methods that they exposed. And so you have to say, like, I want this method callable from the front end. So when we're done walking, we've got that information, and we take that information, the user's PHP code, and we write it to disk. And so now, instead of running the PHP code that you see in the Vue single file component, we are running the transpiled, transformed version that we have written to disk. And so for every Vue single file component, we write one PHP class. And then we also write, for every Vue single file component, we write a PHP class. We also write a JavaScript shim. And the JavaScript shim basically declares, these are the names of the keys. That's it. We don't pass any data down in the build process. These are the names of the keys that are props, and these are the names of the functions that should be exposed as actions. And so then, once everything is built, Fusion is a little bit out of the way, because at that point, we try to hand everything over to the default Laravel request response lifecycle. And instead of routing to a controller, we have one single controller, the Fusion controller. We have one single controller that every single Fusion route points to that Fusion controller. And in that Fusion controller, we look up, okay, what is this request URI? What component does that map to? Let's go find that PHP class that we wrote earlier, and then let's run that class and send down the data and send out the component name, the JavaScript component name. And so at that point, everything runs through a single like entry point controller. we find the class, we send the data out. And then on the front end, every request comes, like every post request comes back to that single controller with a header that says like, hey, here's the component I'm on, and here's the PHP method I want to call. And so then we go and we look up the component, we go and look up the class, we look up the method, we make sure it's allowed, and then we run that and send the response back that way. And so that's kind of the entire process, with the goal being we want to do as much expensive stuff as we can at build time. So we do all our introspection, our reflection, our like writing of little things so that we don't have to look them up later. We do all of that at build time. So then when you ship it off into production, it's like, it's PHP classes written to the disk. Like there's not a lot left to do. So that's kind of the full life cycle there.
So it's like PHP code gen in a way.
Totally. Yes. This is wild. I've got PHP code that writes PHP, PHP code that writes JavaScript code that writes PHP, and JavaScript code that writes JavaScript. So I've got the whole quadrant. I've got it all. Wow. It's all in there. Yeah.
I didn't expect, as someone who used like Laravel quite extensively, that we come to the point where we have like Vue components being there with JavaScript, with JavaScript and PHP crazy. Code. It's insane. But I'm really pumped of giving that a try. Now, you said earlier that Inertia is also part of the mix there. So in which parts is like Inertia relevant to the whole process?
Yeah, so Inertia, what it does is, or what I rely on it for, is basically the client-side routing. That's, with Inertia, it's a little wonky, but it's client-side routing, but it's defined on the server side. Yeah. And Inertia's great power is you send down like this blob of data and this name of, the page that you're navigating to, and Inertia will look up that Vue component and then swap out the whole page and provide like the correct props and all of that. And so that's what I rely on Inertia for. So instead of having to reinvent like, this pseudo client-side routing and this Vue component lookup and this history and all that stuff, I rely on Inertia to route these responses on the client side to find the right components and instantiate them and provide them props.
I see. Also on that note, for everyone who didn't listen to episode 29 yet, that was the episode on Inertia 2.0 with Joe Tannenbaum. So definitely worth checking out if you like.
Dear friend of mine. Love Joe Tannenbaum.
Yeah,
he's
shout
wonderful.
Out. So that's super interesting. And because I also know, and I learned in episode 29 back then, that Inertia can also do server-side rendering like fully.
It can.
Can Fusion also be like fully server-side rendered with like all the front end?
Yes, it totally can. I have not done it yet, but there's nothing technically stopping it from hooking into Inertia's server-side rendering, which I have used, and it's very good. So Inertia relies on a running node process to do that server-side rendering. Yeah. And totally possible to hook into that with Fusion as well.
Amazing. That's checks a lot of boxes here.
I know. That's crazy, right?
Yeah. Maybe before we dive deeper into the tech part, like how did you come up with that idea? Like were you like one day showering like, you know what, if we just take Inertia and just do like 5 exits of like, we go that direction, but further and further. How did that happen?
Yeah. Honestly, that's kind of like, that is also kind of my modus operandi is like, what if we did something, but we did way more than we should reasonably do? And that, that's kind of where we ended up. Yeah. So like I said earlier, I started a company with my friend Steve, and Steve is a big JavaScript guy, loves Vue, loves Nuxt. He's been using it, for a super long time. I'm obviously a big Laravel guy, love Vue, never used Nuxt, but love Vue, have been using, I know, I've heard, been using Vue since, 1.0. And so we're working together, Steve and I, we're working together on these like course platforms. And it obviously makes a ton of sense. I do the Laravel, he does the Vue, we stick Inertia in the middle and everybody's happy. But then Steve comes along and he's been spoiled by all this JavaScript stuff. And he's like, hey, why is it so hard to get data into my Vue templates? Like, why are you defining a route, defining what data should be sent over the wire, and then going into Vue and defining the props? And I'm like, my friend, that's just how it should work. And he's like, no, that's not how it should work. And he's like, why is it so hard to get data out of the URL and like to have these route parameters and grab the query string? And I'm like, you got to do all that on the back end and send it down to the front end. And he's like, this is insane. Why are you doing this? And so my eyes were a little bit opened, working so closely with somebody who was so like dyed in the wool JavaScript guy. And I started to realize like, boy, there actually is a lot of boilerplate here. This is kind of a mess. And so I, was working with Steve, and then I was seeing in the JavaScript communities, I was seeing all of these advances of like, you can write server code and it sends to your client, but not really. And I'm like, wait, what's going on? And so I started to put all these things together and think, wait, in my opinion, Laravel is the best backend available. In my opinion, Vue is the best front end available. It's my absolute favorite. We should be like bringing those two things closer together. And frankly, Steve was like the catalyst for a lot of that, because without him, I wouldn't have realized like the squalor that we were living in and this filth. And he came along and he's like, you live like this? And I was like, yeah, it's great. And so that's kind of where it came from.
And then like, did the two of you also worked on Fusion then together?
So Steve helped me a lot with like the branding and the website and the like API design. I would send him screenshots and he'd be like, that's not great. Yeah. And then, finally near the end, like, days before the conference, near the end, I was sending him screenshots and he was saying, okay, now this is how I want to use / learn Laravel. If this is what you're telling me is possible, I will learn Laravel to use this. And I was like, oh, finally, we've gotten somewhere. We have gotten somewhere. So like when you're writing something, when you're developing something, it's always nice to have an avatar in mind. Like, who is the one person that you're writing this blog post to? Who is the one person that you're designing this interface for? And it was Steve the whole time. I was just like, if I can get Steve on board, then I will know that like JavaScript broadly would at least be amenable to it. They may not all like it, but if Steve, the JavaScript guy, likes it, hey, we're off to a good start. And so that was kind of my guiding light.
Yeah, having like a persona, and like in this case, a real life persona even.
Yeah.
Like, hey, this is like the person I'm aiming like to convince and to say, hey, this is something for you. Perfect. You already mentioned like, okay, the responses must be good. Then how was it received so far? I mean, we are recording, as I said before the actual like repository is released, before people can look at the code, but based on the video you made and your conference talk, and of course, people posting it on all kind of social media. So how did you feel that the community reacted on that?
Overall, I feel great. There are a couple spots that didn't feel super great, but okay. So, I gave this talk in Amsterdam just like a week ago. And while I was on stage, Steve pulled the trigger on releasing a YouTube video. So we kind of like wanted to like focus all of our energy onto this one moment in time. So I'm giving a talk. We release a tweet with like a trailer video that Steve built or made. And then we release a YouTube video, which is a demo of Fusion that I recorded before I left. So trying to do like the whole thing all at once. In person at Laracon, everybody loved it. Everybody, at least everybody that came up to me. Of course, they're not going to come up to me in person and say this is stupid. Maybe, but nobody did. So everyone loved it. Everyone thought, this is great. I love Inertia. This seems like the next step. Or I love what they're doing in Nuxt and Next. I just wish it was easier to do that in Laravel. Those kinds of things, right? And so everybody's like, this is great. Some people are like, you're crazy. How did you do this? This is great. I'm like, hey, that's kind of fun. So that seemed great. Lots of people on Twitter seem to really like it. The people, this will not surprise you, that did not like it were all Redditors. So I would say Reddit was 80% negative in both the Laravel subreddit and the Vue subreddit. The Vue subreddit, I don't spend a lot of time there, and I'm not going to. They were so mean. They hated it so much. Like, kill it before it lays eggs, burn it with fire, go back to teaching databases, stuff like that. And it's like, oh man, like maybe I'm naive. Okay, so maybe I'm naive. And I thought this is a win for the good guys, right? This is a win for the Vue nation. Like, most things come to React first, but I like Vue most. And so let's focus on that.
Yep.
And I thought the Vue subreddit's going to be like, great, they chose us first. And that was just like adorable and totally naive. They freaking hated it. And in every criticism, there's usually something redeemable. I mean, burn it with fire. There's not much I can glean from that, but lots of questions about like, why are we going back to 2004? And totally fair. I think on the internet, a lot of people just read the headline and don't actually like read or watch the thing. And so I don't think a lot of people realized that like, hey, this is, I mean, to be totally frank, this is like syntactic sugar. Like, we're not really like, I'm definitely not transpiling your PHP to WASM, and I'm definitely not like taking your JavaScript and like transpiling it to PHP or something. Like, ne'er the twain shall meet. These are very separate things. It just allows you to do it in one file to maintain that context, and then it sets up like some auto wiring of, you know, stuff up and stuff down. Like, that's basically it. But people were saying like, oh, so now you're going to be mixing your PHP like echo statements into your Vue templates. And I'm like, no, I don't even know how you would do that. Like, no, it's definitely not even possible. And so Reddit was not terribly thrilled. It didn't really bother me because most of them completely missed the point of the library. So overall, I feel just thrilled to death about it. A lot of people like it. Some people super hate it. And frankly, I think that's probably a good thing, that there's like strong feelings both ways.
Well, I always imagine, like when I get feedback, especially negative feedback, I always imagine like this bell curve in my head of like, okay, people way on the left, they hate it. These are the people that are commenting. But then there's like some people who comment and who say they're going to give up like everything in their life to do this new thing. And then there's like most people in the middle are like, yeah, this is cool, or I'm not so sure about it. And it's like, maybe it's like skewed one way or the other a little bit, but like I'm always trying to like remind myself, okay, these people who are being mean, they either missed the point or it's just like 1% of people.
Yeah, they're the minority. That's important. Like, I think most people who've maybe seen it or who will try it out, they don't comment. They just like try it and give it a spin.
Yeah, they're busy using it.
Busy using it or watching the demo video.
You know, there's a lot of like old and tired PHP hate. You know, there's like, oh, are we still using PHP in 2025? And I'm like, brother, we are. A lot of us are. And, you know, those are the people that I can't win over, and I don't really care to. If they think that like PHP is, you know, 2004 WordPress, it's like, that's really not my fight. Like, I would love to try to convince you that like we're modern and cool, but it's at that point, it's like, it's almost religious, right? It's like Vim, Emacs, Mac PC. It's like, I'm just not going to try to convince you because that's a waste of everyone's time.
I agree. Waste of time and energy. You could do way more amazing things, like working for on Fusion or your company.
Yeah, exactly. So, I got a lot of stuff to do.
Yeah. I personally was really surprised. Like, I took a look at the Reddit. I have to admit, I am quite active on the Reddit. No, I didn't write any comments, to be fair. But I read through them. I was also like, how is that possible? Because usually, especially in the Vue world, there are not that many controversial things. I think the peak polarizing topic is composition versus options API. And that's like, I think that's like really the peak where people have like really strong opinions. And no matter what you say, sure, even though they're like, yeah, whatever. I think the next thing is like JavaScript versus TypeScript. But it also like, we all, I think, kind of slowly like moved over to TypeScript. There are some people who are not. That's also fine. I haven't seen that kind of response like in a long time so far, and I was really surprised. And I also wondered, like, okay, is it related to these three like letters that upset so many people? PHP, is it really that? But I also, like, with my background as someone who used Laravel quite frequently and like was like the one big framework I started with in terms of web development, I never understood the hate around it. Like, even back then, it was always like, oh, PHP, it's so old-fashioned and whatnot. Well, honestly, like, it is such a complete framework, which you can do so many amazing things. And especially when deployment is so easy, as you don't need a build step or anything. Yeah, I never got that. But I also think this is a big part why people were like, oh my God, I don't even read further. I see PHP and Vue combined. Hell no. Goodbye.
I know.
But that's in my opinion, it's really a shame. And I also saw like that you tweeted about that. And I really like how you dealt with the responses there and what happened.
Yeah, I tweeted a little bit tongue in cheek that like I found the best Reddit hack. And the best Reddit hack is when people are really cynical and mean, you just respond sincerely and they just crumble. And that's kind of like my whole thing is like, I'm not going to be a mean, cynical person on the internet because I think there are enough of those. And I would like to be an example of something different. And being on Reddit is like that. My rules don't end at Reddit. And so while I do that on Twitter, I will also do that on Reddit. And so like on Reddit, I have a picture of my face and my real name. And when people say mean things, I respond with sincerity and curiosity. And so like a lot of these people would be like saying something horrible. And then I would respond and be like, man, I'm sorry you don't like it. Is there anything that I could do better? And, so like all to the person, almost everyone would respond and say, oh, I'm sorry, I was just joking around. This looks really amazing. I can't believe you've done this. And I'm like, why didn't you start there? It doesn't have to be for everyone. I'm not going to try to convince the whole world to use it. But if you don't like it, like you don't have to say anything. But if you think it's amazing and I've done something cool and you don't want to use it, maybe say that. Like, that's totally fine. And so I got a few people that actually DM'd me on Reddit and were like, hey, Aaron, I'm really sorry. I feel ashamed for my comment. I was having a bad day. I've deleted it. And I'm like, that's totally fine. I get it. And I think what a lot of people forget that there's like a real human on the other side of Reddit. And so when I respond with like my actual name and my actual face and say like, oh, wow, I'm sorry. I put a lot of work into this. Is there a part of it that like is not clear or you don't like? They realize, oh man, this is just a guy that's like trying to make it in the world. And they just totally crumble. I think a lot of people on like the opposite side of that, the people receiving that like mean, cynical nature, they forget that everyone wants to be important. Like everyone wants to be recognized. Everyone wants to feel valuable. And a lot of people on Reddit do that by like having the most snarky one-up comment of like, I'm the funniest, or I got the most like replies or something. Yeah. And I think it's very dismissive. Like in my position, it's very dismissive to forget the fact that like, that is also a real person. That is also a real person. And the way that they're expressing that they want to feel important is not my preferred way of expressing it, which is like by being the smartest, meanest, most cynical person. That's not how I like to do it. But it would be foolish of me to forget that that person just wants to like feel like they're important. They just want to feel special. They just want to feel loved. And you know how I know that? Because I want that. Like everybody wants that. Everybody wants to feel special. Everybody wants to feel important. Everybody wants to feel like I did something cool and people clapped for me. And the way that that expresses itself a lot on Reddit is by who can be the most cynical. And so there's a lot of like human things at play here. And I think if you can recognize them, you can like de-escalate pretty quickly.
And also turn it into something nice in the end. Like just getting honest feedback or like constructive feedback. Say, hey, this is amazing. I want to use it. But yeah, I agree. Like, why don't you write it all? Well, because it doesn't give that many upvotes. Because like some rage bait or some, like you said, snarky cynical comment is all the way to the top. And still, I feel like I agree in a lot of subreddits, that's the case. Once again, this feels like an exception in the Vue Reddit, at least. As I said, I've seen quite some threads there, be it about, oh, how many people still use Options API? That's so crazy. Or where someone said, oh yeah, Vue 4 should fully remove the Options API. This, that, a few things. But this is, so I'll tell you, this is not a daily thing there. And usually people are quite kind in terms of answering or like giving feedback. So maybe in the future you could come back. And
maybe after the library is fully out and people can play with it and realize that it's not like, PHP templating of like from the days of yore. Maybe then it'll turn a little bit. But I think what's really gonna, if anything, what's really gonna turn it is people start to like it. They just are like, I don't know if this is like technically pure, but boy, am I fast and productive and making great apps. That's the only thing that's only thing that's gonna win people over.
But I also think like with that comes, content, other people sharing their thoughts on it, and that also snowballs in a way. So I fully agree. And I really think what you mentioned earlier on, like the whole part of, things are usually React first, and here we have something that's Vue first. And then it's even more sad that people react like, oh yeah, what the heck? So I feel that. I feel that every time like we get something the Vue ecosystem or like something that's related to the Vue, because we're like, that's amazing, great. And some people might port it over or whatsoever. But usually, of course, with React being sadly the dominant framework, sadly from my position personally.
Mine too.
Then it's like, okay, we port things over, like, I don't know, ShadCN or Radix or whatnot. And it's great that this is also happening. It takes people who do that work, and that's amazing. And sometimes that also turns into something own. But of course, people are usually happiest, like, hey, this is like first-class citizen. This comes from that ecosystem. So also on that note, thank you so much for bringing that out. Right?
Yeah, of course.
I think it's really amazing.
Yeah, thanks. Like I said, I started with Vue back in the 1.0 days when Taylor Otwell, creator of Laravel, was like, "Hey, Vue's kind of cool."
The legendary tweet.
Let's use Vue, and I've been using it ever since. And actually, back in like I think it was like 2016 or something, I had a Vue project that was somewhat similar to this, but it was all based around, we use an active record pattern. We use Eloquent, and it was all based around like sending rich models to the front end, and so it was kind of the same thing, frankly, but it attached like model methods to your Vue objects. And even back in 2016, I was thinking like, man, how do I combine Vue and Laravel even more? And so I've been around Vue. Vue makes sense to my brain. I like Vue a lot. Don't tell the subreddit, but I like Options API. I think it's great. It just makes sense to me. I think one of the big distinctions on options and composition is, are you historically a backend or a front-end developer? I think that's like where a lot of the lines fall down. It's like, as a historically backend developer, that structure just makes a lot of sense to me. And I've seen Evan's like image of like all the colored blocks and they're all split up, and then with the setup, they're all together. And I'm like, that also makes sense to me. It's just like a preference thing. So I've been around Vue. I love Vue. I love what Evan and team are doing with it. I hope whatever's new, Void Zero, doesn't, distract him from keeping Vue going, because Vue is my favorite front-end framework by far.
A lot of things dropped here, and that's I think I love him to Vue there. Amazing.
So your vision for Fusion, it'll have been released by the time this podcast comes out. Are you like at the point where you've basically done what you wanted to do with this, or do you have like plans for the future of this thing? Like, where do you see this going? Are there other areas where you think you can simplify things and make it easier?
Totally. Yeah, so I do have a few big things on the roadmap. There's a whole already forming a community of people that are trying to get it into React, and I'm super grateful for them, and I think that will be important for the story. I don't know React. I've never written React in my life, and so I'm going to rely on community a lot for that. I think the thing that I am most interested in, the couple of things coming up here, one would be shared types across the front and back end. And so one thing that is already possible, and I have already done it, but it's not good enough to like say that it's done, and so I've pulled it out. But one thing that is already possible is, because I'm taking all of your PHP code and walking that tree, I know either by your PHP type declaration, which we have pretty robust type support in PHP, I either know by the fact that you declared it a certain type, or we also have type annotations where you can annotate and say, like, it's kind of like JSDoc, honestly, and say like, this is the type, please trust me. I can parse both of those. And because I'm writing a shim file for every single component, I can translate those types into a JavaScript type. And so I actually I found somebody through the power of the internet that's on the Vue core like language team or whatever. They helped write a plugin, which I've not implemented yet, but they've written a plugin wherein I can augment the TypeScript or definition of the Vue single file component, such that when you start to type one of these magic variables that was defined in PHP, your editor knows exactly what you're talking about. So you get, type completion, you get the dot, and then it pops down all the other methods, like you get everything. And so that's a big story. I think if this is going to have any legs in the JavaScript community, it needs to have some level of either type safety or type hinting or type inference or something like like that. And even I, as a historically PHP developer that doesn't rely on strict types, when I'm typing in my, Vue template and I'm getting autocomplete for these variables, it's like, yeah, I want that. Like, of course I want that. So that's big one, and is technically totally feasible. I think the other two that I really want, one would be, right now everything is defined at the page level. So we have this concept of like pages that map to routes, right? And the page is just a Vue component, but it is a page. And then you've got all your other components, podcast row, podcast favorite button, all of that stuff. But the podcast page is where you can write PHP. I think it would be nice if every component could write some subset of PHP, probably not sending data down, because the data would probably still need to come down from the page as props to the subcomponents. But if every component could define API endpoints where it does a thing without having to emit out to the page and then go out to the PHP and then come back and down, I think being able to write a PHP block for a Vue component that is not a page would be very, very interesting. And then finally, the thing I think that brings me all the way back to 2016 is having a rich Fusion resource. And so like in Laravel, we've got eloquent models. That's our active record implementation. There is a thin layer on top of that can be used to translate between the eloquent model and then HTTP response. And that is called a resource. So you can have like a podcast model, and then you can have a podcast resource, which says like, don't show the updated timestamps. And in fact, let's change the auto incrementing ID into a nano ID so we don't expose our IDs or whatever, right? And that resource handles the translation to like, what is your API response? I think having a Fusion resource where you can say like, here's the podcast model, here's the Fusion resource, which defines what state or like what is the representation of the state, but also what are some methods, right? So maybe you want to, in this Fusion resource, you want to have like, favorite podcasts, listen later, whatever, delete. And you can send that out to Fusion. And then in your Vue components, you can say like podcast.delete, and it like executes an HTTP action because it was sent out as a Fusion resource. And so that's still a little murky. That's further off in the distance. And so it's not totally clear yet. But I think having the ability to, one, define how the state is represented for a model, and two, define some behavior for a model specifically is a little bit different than defining it at the component level, because then anywhere you send a podcast, you're getting this same kind of like rich representation of state and behavior.
Super interesting. I think you already mentioned something that is also on the list for sure, the whole type safety part. Do you remember who helped you on, who worked like on the, I guess, like Volar or Vue extension or something?
I don't. I'm going to open Discord right now. But yes. It's funny because it's somebody with like an anime avatar and somebody that like, I don't know. I have no idea who this person is. And the way that I paid this person, so this is like paid work, of course. I'm like, hey, I need help. I'm willing to pay. The way that I paid this person was I sponsored somebody named Jonathan, I think.
Johnson, probably.
Johnson, yes. Yeah. I sponsored that person for $400, and then presumably they sent the money to this other person because the original person was like, I can't receive money where I am. And I was like, okay, well, how do I pay you? Kazari EX is the name.
Yeah, he contributes a lot to like the Vue extension. So
yeah, there you go.
Out. Also like lots of Volar.
Yeah. I originally reached out to Nuxt guy Daniel, right? What's his last name?
Daniel Rowe, yeah. Also,
yeah, Daniel,
friend
great
of the
guy,
show.
super nice guy. Love him to death. Reached out to him, and then somebody turned me on to Johnson, and I DM'd Johnson, and then Johnson was like, I can't do it. Why don't you talk to this person? It looks like their real name might be Memori Mabarashi, but their handle is Kazari EX. Yeah. And this person just came out of nowhere with an anime avatar, someone I've never met, and I paid them US dollars to produce a thing, and it's just like the power of the internet. It's amazing.
It certainly is. Yeah, I know like Kazari made some really, really good contributions. I also don't know their real name, but that person is super involved.
Yes, super smart too. They had it done. I thought like, oh, I don't know if this is possible. And they had it done in like, I don't know, 6-8 hours or something. And
Wow.
yeah, it was crazy. And they gave me a repo and I still need to integrate it. But the video they sent me showed them clicking on a variable in the Vue template and the cursor pops up to the PHP block where that variable is defined.
Ooh,
And I
that's
was
so
like,
nice.
holy crap, this is amazing. So they did some amazing work.
Sweet. And I remember like Evan was also commenting or like tweeting. It's like, hey, is everything works regarding like IntelliSense with like PHP and the blog there. That also like brought me out like, okay, how does the tooling support look there?
Yes. So tooling support, that's a great question. So right now, the editor that I use is JetBrains editor. It's called PHP Storm. And in PHP Storm, you can do like a language injection. So you can like say, whenever you see this XML tag, which in our case is just PHP, inject the language PHP. And so right out of the gate, with nobody's help, like no JetBrains help, we get syntax highlighting, a little bit of autocomplete, but the language injection, it's almost like you're writing a PHP script. It doesn't recognize the broader context of like import these classes, autocomplete this import, that sort of stuff. And so I am currently in an email communication with the JetBrains team to figure out how do we bring more robust support to like a PHP tag so that it is aware of all of the composer dependencies that are able to be imported and that type of stuff. And then on VS Code, I don't know. We've got a lot of people, you know, I've got a Slack going. We've got a lot of people that use VS Code. And this one guy, Miguel, has already written some support for like PHP inside of a tagged template literal for React. And so like there's definitely some tooling work to be done, but I think it will come relatively quickly because you're writing like honest to goodness PHP. You're not like writing a new language. It's just a matter of saying, hey, please recognize this block as PHP. Not like, here are all the rules for my new language that you now have to support. Like, I imagine that's what probably Svelte went through, which is like, we're inventing new syntax. Like, please support it. We don't have to go that far because it is pure Vue and pure PHP, just in places you wouldn't normally expect. And so I'm hoping it will be quick.
Yeah, I guess also that's like, you could even go a bit further of like, okay, you can write PHP there. And if you need some like Laravel specific, I don't know, auto imported things, I know if there's a thing like, I don't know, a DD or something, then probably like if there's, I don't know how the state of the Laravel VS Code extension is, but if that's already available, yeah, it's just about like plugging that in the right spot. And also the framework Johnson wrote, it's called Volar. That's powering, for example, the Vue extension and also like MDX support and whatnot and Astro and all that. So that could maybe also be of help here for doing like more than just saying, okay, here's the PHP tag. I recognize PHP and have like auto completion, but even going beyond it. So I'm really curious where that way is going. And with
these Volar people, these language tooling people, they are on another level. It is. I've looked. I think Johnson was like, why don't you go look at Volar? And I looked, and my eyes just, what is going on here? They're so smart.
It's insane. And I really like, I love to highlight that fact that a Volar, so that was originally just like the Vue extension. And then Johnson realized, hey, this could work for, let's say, Angular components or Svelte components or anything out there. So why not make it more general? And that's how Volar was born. So like going the extra mile, like, I don't know, viewed it with Vite or also like the whole, like all the un.js things. So basically moving something that works for a certain community step further to improve the whole like web ecosystem. This is so lovely. Now even being used for communicating with Laravel and Vue, hopefully. It's always great to see.
So I've been thinking about, as you've been describing this, I've been thinking, well, why not do this with Nuxt? Like Nuxt has a whole different, like we're writing JavaScript on the back end. So why not also have this with Nuxt? And I ended up finding there's some project from about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, called Server Block Nuxt, which is a similar kind of thing, but you're actually like writing the HTTP handlers like in your single file component. So it's not quite as sugary, but that would be very interesting to see how far you could take that with Nuxt and see like, can you also do something similar with the Nuxt framework?
Yeah, so I will rely on you here because I don't know very much about Nuxt, and so I'll ask you a few questions. One is, so with Nuxt, you have this backend ability, right? You've got this backend place where you can write code. So somebody, I think on Twitter, was like, hey, why don't you bring Fusion to Nuxt? And out of sheer ignorance, I had no answer because my thought was with Nuxt, you have your Vue front end and your, JavaScript backend, and, you combine the two with Nuxt. But then once you get onto the back end, I know that some people use Nuxt with Laravel. So is it like the front end makes an API request to whatever this backend handler is, and then this backend handler in JavaScript makes an API request over to a Laravel backend? And so that was the thing that I was like trying to figure out, was that feels like too many steps to me to have two backends at play. But again, not something I'm super familiar with.
Yeah, so the good part is that, let's say you can write your whole application, of course, like full stack in Nuxt, say, okay, I have my JavaScript, TypeScript backend and do whatever I want there. But nothing stops you, similar to a Vue SPA, to say, okay, I have my Nuxt application, no matter if it's server-side rendered or not, and that just does API requests to any kind of API. That can be Django, Laravel, whatnot, JavaScript. So on that level, that would work. And you don't really have to integrate much with any kind of like extra backend, so to say. So probably you could do the same transforms. You just say, okay, where is basically my Laravel backend? So I can, I don't know, let's say you have a mono repo. So these two projects, Git repository all together, and then say, okay, yeah, I do this build step. Oh, here is my Laravel backend. Just move it there and write it there. So I don't see why that wouldn't necessarily work. I think the trickier part is more like the whole DevOps thing of like, okay, execute it, deploy it together. But all in all, I think that would be possible, because
interesting.
I see the point that you're like, okay, we have this like own, let's say, server engine called Nitro, which you can also use standalone. It's a bit like Express.js, so like very bare bone, but has a lot of integrations. Nevertheless, you can, of course, write your backend there, as I mentioned, but you don't have to use it. So you can just say, I do an API call, it's all fine. And you can still like integrate a lot of things thanks to like all the hooks that Nuxt offers. Yeah, you can integrate like a Vue plugin there easily, or you can even say, okay, I want to customize things on my own. So that's definitely something that might be worth exploring.
Okay, yeah. If it works, I'm all for it. I think it would be very interesting to try to figure out how to make that all happen. This is another, like we talked about at the beginning, I'm not qualified. Like there are so many things that I just don't know. And so like, this is very helpful to understand that life cycle. It's very helpful to have React people in the Slack to like tell me what React is and how it works. And like, definitely. I think that's another fear that people have, is like, I have to know everything. Listen, y'all, I know very little. I know so little. And so thank you for explaining how that could potentially work.
No problem at all. I mean, in the end, how would you know all of that? You didn't try all the technologies, and even then, you're not an expert in all of these. So
exactly, yes.
I think it's also so key to say, okay, here is a knowledge gap, and that can be just on purpose. Like, oh no, I don't write React every day, or like I never did. So I find people who are interested in saying, hey, we can work together to make that happen. Here is what the mental model is. How can that fit? And like the whole collaboration part, I mean, that's also how frameworks like especially Vue in the end works out. Of course, like Evan put a lot of effort into that, but there's so many core team members. And of course, also like then the whole like tooling part with Volar, as we mentioned as well. People working on Vapor mode right now, which is also super interesting. And in the end, it's all a big collaboration. While, for example, I don't know, if you're a Vue user, you don't necessarily are good at writing a framework. So like also getting there, you get in touch with people, and that's so key. Fully agree.
Yeah, Michael, I don't know if you get this a lot, but I get a lot of, because I make videos, people are like, hey, why don't you compare Laravel and Phoenix? And I'm like, because I've never used Phoenix. Like I can't. It would be dishonest. Do you get that a lot?
Yeah, or sometimes I ask for feedback on like, oh, what should I do with mastering Nuxt? And then they give me some extremely specific, like, oh, show how to use this UI library that I've never heard of, also to make like, an app for a bowling alley so they can do this. And it's like, I mean, I've been bowling before, but I don't know what this other thing is. So like,
yep. Don't know the rules of the game. Never use the library. Yeah. What do you want me to say?
Yeah.
I think also like this is so common that a lot of people also just try to do it. Like a lot of people are like, okay, I want to do everything. Like, okay, I will compare all of this together. And then you have the problem that, well, how do you differentiate between, is this actual someone who has like I don't know,
Yes.
a profound experience in both to compare that. So, and
Yep.
this is super tricky. Like also as someone who's doing videos every week, it's like, I try to be really clear. It's like, okay, look, or like on one of my streams, actually, it was like someone talking about UI libraries and how this is performance-wise worse versus that. And if I could have looked, I am not contributing to any of these libraries. I can't tell you much. I can look through the GitHub issues and tell you my opinion of the discussion, but that's all. So like in a way, it's also like having the courage, but just being there to say, hey, I don't know. This is so important. I am very happy that like I learned it after time. I was also like a little bit of a know-it-all. Oh yeah, this and that. But at some way, like the powerful words of I don't know, or sometimes just a no, they're so good and they're so important.
You are absolutely correct that it takes a lot of courage to say, I don't know, because everyone wants you to give like a definitive answer. And everyone like, we all know that the more definitive, controversial answers you give, the better the engagement is. And so it takes a lot of courage to be like, I'm sorry, I can't offer an opinion on that. I've never used that, or I've never shipped that to production, or I don't have a deep enough knowledge. It's like, sorry guys, I can't help you there. I think that is the right thing to do if it is the true thing, but it's still like, oh, I kind of want to just start a storm of engagement, but that's not the right thing to do.
It's even beyond tech, right? It's a lot of things. Like, I don't know, a classic thing is sports, for example. Everybody's like a sports expert now and give their opinion. Where it's like, I'm also like, if someone asks me, I'm like, okay, I'm happy to share my thoughts, but look, I'm not there to judge these because I don't know. I didn't study it for long enough. I didn't research enough, or just say, hey, I'm happy to talk about it. I inform myself. Next time we have a conversation, let's talk about it. Or I write a post later on. That's always better than like, oh, here's some like dangerous, like half-cooked, half-baked knowledge that you bring into that. And then people, I don't know, quote that, use that further. And it's always tricky. But that's definitely a skill that a lot of people, if you feel like, oh, you don't say no often enough, or I don't know, that's definitely something to train. That's surely
one of my favorite ways out of that is to just say, I don't know enough to say. Like, I don't have enough information. I can't give you an answer.
That's also good. Or like, I don't have an opinion on that.
Oh, that's the best. No opinion. It's like, really? You don't have to have an opinion on everything? You sure don't. You sure don't.
There's one more thing. We think we get a kind of bit technical once again on Fusion, because that came up when you said, okay, you do these PHP calls under the hood, and especially in the front end, we have a lot of course, state management to do. So as these are all API calls, how do you handle things like errors, the status of the request? And then from that even further of like parallelization, possibly, can we do like certain things together, avoiding waterfalls? So like all these more, let's say, technical, tricky things, where I don't know, things like 10-stack query or like Pina Colada, which is work in progress, exist to deal with like server states, like fetching these things.
I've not heard of Pina Colada. That's a great name. I do like Pina, but I've not heard of Pina Colada. So kind of the life cycle somewhat handles a lot of that. So like when you first load /podcasts or whatever, the data is going to come down with the response. And so like all of your, the list of podcasts or whatever state you have declared is going to come down with that first response as like a JSON blob or bundle or whatever. If it's like I've opened a new tab and navigated to the site, it all comes down in like embedded in the page. And if it's like I click on a link, an Inertia link, the response that comes back from the server is the JSON state decorated with a little bit of like, hey, here's the component they're loading. And so all of the state is going to be there. Now, when it comes to like, I want to execute an action. So I want to like favorite the podcast or whatever. When Fusion writes, writes the functions into your Vue component, it does it in a way that is slightly decorated. And so let's say you've on the back end, you've exposed a method called favorite. So then in your front end, you have this function, this JavaScript function called favorite. That function is basically just a thin HTTP, it's just kind of a shim around a common HTTP request, and we'll like gather up the correct data, send it off, get it back. Inside of like this broader, so like favorite and unfavorite are basically just decorators around this big function call. And in the function call, it does a few things. One is it is actually a proxy. And so this function favorite, if you like look really closely, you'll see that it is a proxy. And what this allows me to do is not only have like favorite open close parentheses execute the action, you can also say like favorite dot busy. And that will tell you if that function is in progress or not.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because, so every single Fusion function comes with its own reactive state that is actually on that same named variable. So you could do favorite open close parentheses, that will fire the request. You can do favorite dot, I forget what it's called, in progress, and that'll say true or false, and it is a reactive. And so you can just throw that in your template and it will flicker the like loading indicator or whatever. It comes with succeeded, failed, and finished. So you can see all of those. But it also comes with recently succeeded, recently failed, and recently finished. And what that allows you to do is have like a flash message that says like success, and then it goes away. And so instead of like writing your own set timeout for, hey, this thing just finished, let's turn success on to true, and 3 seconds later turn it back to false, like we'll handle that. We handle that for recently succeeded, recently failed, and recently finished. We also have, because we are a Laravel, tool, we know what a 422 response back from Laravel looks like. Right. And so what we can do is we can pull the errors off of it. So you get like an error bag that says like, here are all the fields and here are all the messages. And also Laravel provides a top level message. So if you like want to traverse the whole errors object and put stuff everywhere, you can. If you just want to show a single message, Laravel gives you, I think it's probably like the first error, it gives you the readable message.
Yeah.
And so in this example, you have favorite dot errors, and that's just like a JSON object of all the errors. You've got favorite dot error message, and that's just like the human readable message. And so all of these things are kind of like decorated around this HTTP request response. And so what we do is we send off the request, we get the response back, we do a little bit of processing as Fusion, which would include like, is it a 422, set this stuff, change the state from in progress to not in progress, whatever. But we also, because we're in control of both sides, we can grab this response and see if there's any like Fusion state that needs to be updated. Right. So we can send a response back, send a request, get the response, inspect the response and say, hey, did Fusion send me anything that needs to be updated? Forget like whatever the user's function returned for a second. Did they send me anything where I need to update some state? If so, let me update that state and then strip all of that out. And so then the response that you get in your Vue, script tag or whatever is the response that you would expect from your PHP, because we've taken away all of this meta information, done some interesting things with it, like sync the query string, perhaps, done some interesting things with it. And then we give you like the honest to goodness response that you would have been expecting, having processed everything out of it at that point.
That was a lot. But I think that makes a lot of sense. And I really like how, let's say, nice and in sync the implementation, of course, because it's like Laravel and Vue together, is of like, okay, we can go through the errors. It's not a problem. We know how the shape looks like. So in a way that it's focused on Laravel gives the benefit of like, okay, we know exactly how things look like. So I really like that benefit there. Plus also, as you said before, using the underlying power of Inertia to just say, okay, here's the JSON. That's all good. That's super helpful.
Fusion is my interpretation of what Inertia would have been if it focused only on Laravel. And so Inertia had a different vision, which I think is a good and correct vision. It's just different. Inertia was like, we can be all things to all people. And they successfully pulled that off. Like Rails uses Inertia, React uses Inertia. Everybody can and does use Inertia. Fusion is my vision for what if Inertia was Laravel only, and we leaned fully into that. And these are some of the good things that we get out of that, is we know what's going to come back. We know exactly what's going to come back, and we know how to route it on the back end. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm excited about, is we're living in one back end world, and we can control it very strictly.
Though I also think the same would probably work with the same, let's say, blueprint in terms of the, let's say, idea behind it, right? Okay, we have that build step that could probably also work in like, I don't know, Phoenix, Ruby, with Rails, Django. So the concept itself can be let's say, copy it.
Yes, 100%.
Of course, it has to be adapted to the frameworks then, but the same idea could then also work. So maybe even in the future, could you imagine that you also, let's say, at least open up the opportunity to people say, hey, this is a Fusion not for Laravel, but like a Fusion Django or similar?
Oh, I would love that. If you're out there listening and I'm thinking I want to do this for Django, call me. I would love to help with that. I do think that this space is wide open. Like if you're out there and you're a Rails developer and you're like looking to make a project or make a name for yourself, I think this space is wide open. Like Inertia went very wide, and for going so wide, it went very far.
True.
But I still think there's a lot of ground to cover in terms of like, let's bring Rails together with React. There's just like, there's so much open space and nobody, in my opinion, is tackling it yet.
Yeah, so definitely call Aaron. The phone number is in.
Yeah. Call me. It's x.com/Aaron D. Francis.
Easy peasy. No, I'm really curious how and if that will. I mean, not if. The if is clear. How that will shake up the front end space, because in a way also you have this pendulum of like server, client, back to server, but we're like going closer and closer together, and I like Fusion is really doing that. It fuses these two parts together.
Yeah, exactly.
Love the naming there as well, which is like on point. So
I owe that to someone you might know, Josh Siri. He works at Laravel. He's a big JavaScript guy. I was DMing him and Joe Tenenbaum, friend of the show. I was DMing both of them because they have good taste, and Josh has a lot of JavaScript experience, and Joe's the Inertia guy. And I was like, all right, here's some ideas. What do you think? And they're like, yes, no. And then I finally said, like, I need a name. I don't have a name for this freaking thing. And Josh gave me like 4 names, and Fusion was one of them. And I was like, Fusion is perfect. So thanks, Josh Siri.
Shout out there. Yes. I also love to have him on the show. So Josh, when you're listening to that because you read the tweet mentioning you,
there you go.
Come on.
He's great. He would be great on the show. I like him a lot.
100%. We had a panel recently. Actually, just the previous episode, we had an AI panel at Vue.js Nation. There, we also did a panel on Laravel and Vue together. So that was really lovely to listen to.
Cool.
I think we got some really good grounds covered there. I wonder, maybe we could go into like a little bit in terms of Vue specifics, so a bit further away from Fusion. So you mentioned, and we asked this a lot of guests here, you mentioned that you're a big fan of the options API, not so much of the composition API. Now, you already explained briefly why you think that makes sense. And I really was interested in the take of, and I heard it before as well, that like people, especially coming from the backend, prefer the structure of the options API, while people that are like, I don't know, start maybe from another base, maybe even React, or like, okay, the front end world are more of the composition API fans. Why do you think is that?
I look at the composition API and it reads top to bottom, right? So you look at it and you're like, I'm going to do some stuff and do some more stuff. And you just work your way all the way down. And then finally it's like, done, and like this magic stuff gets exposed. No problem with magic stuff. I love magic stuff. But from my point of view, the traditionally backend developer typically likes to work in an object-oriented pattern, right? And so unless you're like a functional programmer or whatever, but I think a lot of backend developers feel very at home in like a class structure, where you can say like, I'm going to declare my class level properties at the top. Then I'm going to write some public methods and then some protected methods, and then very rarely some private methods or whatever. And it kind of encapsulates all of this state and behavior. And I know where like to go look for stuff. And so I think backend developers looked at the options API and were like, oh, this maps relatively to kind of like a backend class. Like you start at the top, you've got your data, and then you move down, you've got your lifecycle hooks, then your methods, or maybe your computeds, and then your methods and whatever. And that to me, like just slots into my brain super well. Whereas the composition API, I'm like looking at it and I'm like, this feels like procedural PHP, where it's like old script PHP, which is not to say that it's a bad format or it is an old JavaScript style, but it does remind me of an old PHP style. And so when I look at that, I think, boy, this is like writing PHP scripts in 2002, 2003, before we had like the enlightenment of object orientation. And I think that's a little bit of the dissonance is, in PHP, that is an old style. In JavaScript, that's a perfectly modern and acceptable and maybe even preferred style. And so like this also happened to me when I observed from the outside React switch away from class-based components to this functional hooks. Like, you got to have all these use. And it's like, that just doesn't make a lot of sense to my brain, which is not to say that it's wrong. It is to say that I don't like it. And so with the React hooks, don't like it, makes no sense to me. I have no idea what all these side effects are, what is going on. With the Vue composition, I'm very sensitive to Evan's great diagram of the colors becoming all close together, do all these things together. It just doesn't click with my brain. And so I don't know if I'm speaking for all backend developers, but as a backend developer, that's how I view it.
I've never heard that take before, but it's a very interesting one that it's like it fits in with the backend mentality in a bit more. Yeah.
Which is honestly, I think a big reason when Taylor was like, hey, y'all, we use Vue now. Everybody was like, sure, that makes sense. Yeah, it was kind of like a class on the front end. We've got some state, we've got some behavior, and that's great.
It's interesting. That fits a bit more to OP in terms of also okay, you have things structured. You have your, I don't know, class fields, let's say. I wonder if it's more about how people write code with the composition API, because you said the structure, and I think this is a big part. I see this almost day to day in projects where options API, at least people know where to put things, right? Okay,
yes,
I put in my data, I put in my methods. In composition API, the problem is people have to come up with the structure, right?
Yes.
It's like Wild West, because you can put things everywhere. You can have these. We talked about 5,000 lines controllers. You can have 5,000 lines components with script setup there, all just as you said, imperatively, procedurally written down. And the problem there is that this, of course, is not really how the composition API was imagined. So it's really good you mentioned this wonderful chart with the colored blocks. We often I reference to it in almost every workshop, and also on the show a few times. We'll also include in the show notes as well. The fun part is people sometimes ask, yeah, this is very pixelated, of course, because it's more about the big picture, but how does the code look like? And if you take a look at the code itself, then you have a Vue file from the Vue CLI, which is not used anymore, with options composition API, and Evan rewrote that. And the interesting part is what he's doing is something that Michael and I commonly refer to as inline composables. So instead of just writing these I don't know, a couple hundred lines or so, from top to bottom, you have functions. You also write, of course, functions like PHP or plain JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever. And now you can say, okay, these you could just put in your methods and you're done. But then you still have the problem of okay, you have to go through the whole code to find the things. So instead you say, I have this certain thing. You can imagine being a PHP class, or just in this case, it's a composable with the use in front. And I have everything related to one concern in there. How can I get the current working directory or the network or whatsoever? So you execute that in there, everything runs. There's let's say the own little cosmos in there, it would be in a PHP class, and you get something out there that you either reuse or say, hey, use in template or whatnot. And if you have, especially with bigger components, then structuring is not oh, damn it, I'm it's just code overflow everywhere. It's too much.
Right.
It's really more okay, if I have really things that I can't spin up in other components because orchestration, a lot of business logic, I can at least split them up in certain composables with their duties. I can put them extra files, but I don't have to. So in this way, at least especially in bigger components, it's more manageable. There still needs structure, obviously. And we also had, for example, Natalia Tabluhina from the core team, who does a lot of documentation work, said also she works at GitLab, and they have, of course, a ton of developers. Finding a structure that works for all of them will be tricky. So they're also migrating composition API at some point and saying, options API, it's just easy. You know where to find things, no matter which skill level. While someone who's an expert programmer versus a junior would do things totally different, where to put things, where to structure things. Totally. So there are definitely let's say advantages if you have a rather big skill difference in your team, or rather small, for example. But at least with, let's say, applying the composition API in what it was meant to be, or how it was thought, at least it can help a bit. But I still get the point for sure.
Yeah, I think the most compelling example it's in the Vue docs talking about composables is the use mouse or use mouse position or whatever that is. And that's very that resonates with me. The example is basically let's encapsulate a little bit of state, a little bit of reactivity, maybe some behavior, I don't remember, into this use mouse position or whatever. And then you can just consume it. And boy, that speaks to my OOP heart, where it's like, let's encapsulate some stuff. I love encapsulating.
Exactly.
So that part makes total sense to me. Going back to how composition API was intended and how it is being expressed in the real world, this goes back to the I don't have an opinion. And so like one thing that I like about the options API is that it has opinions for me.
That's
and
true.
so I don't have to come up with or read or listen to or argue about what is the correct way to format my composition API, like what is the best practice. Those are great things for people to talk about. That is not something that I am interested in talking about, right?
Fair.
And so I like the options API because it's kind of like the right down the middle. Like, is it the best? I don't know. Is it the worst? I don't think so.
Definitely
but
not.
It works.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing. And Evan, if you're listening, please don't ever get rid of it. But that's another thing where I'm like, this is just a total like religious, spiritual battle of I prefer this and you prefer that and we're going to fight. And it's like, you know what? Like you made a very compelling argument just then for composition, and I'm still going to use options because it's like,
sure.
it's lower mental overhead for somebody that is not a Vue expert.
That's a key part. Yeah, 100%. Like if it resonates, if you, and that's also important, can be productive with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you can achieve what you want, then use it. And also on that note, luckily we had Evan on the show a couple of times, and he luckily confirmed options API won't go anywhere, also not in Vue 4. So we're safe for a little bit.
Thank you, Evan. Sorry to all the Redditors and the listeners who hate it, but thank you, Evan. I appreciate that.
Actually, you would be surprised how many people on Reddit love the options API and say, hey, composition is horrible. You wouldn't believe it. Yeah.
Really? On Twitter, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, that's right.
How funny. Okay, well, that's good. Maybe I will go back to Reddit. Yeah. Who knows?
I'll ping you in the next options versus composition
API please do.
Post. So, yeah, I really think also their Vue's options API was and still is an identity part of the whole framework, right? That's why a lot of people picked it. Because like, I don't know, I don't have a PhD in TypeScript to use it. Or like, for example, I know I have to understand all the patterns of Angular, but just like, okay, it's pretty simple, small things. Yeah, data, props, computed, all smooth.
I think we talked about a lot of stuff. I have one last question for you that's completely non-technical, or maybe it is technical. I know it depends on your answer to this. But so I've got a 10-month-old daughter, and you have 2 sets of twins, if I'm correct. And so I'm curious, how do you get anything done?
Yeah,
because it seems like you're producing courses, you're creating the next hot open source project. So
he also has a podcast.
So I do.
We didn't even mention the podcast.
That's true.
Yeah.
Mostly technical.
So a few things. One, yes, to set the stage, I have 2 sets of twins. One set is 3.5 years old, boy, girl. One set is 1 year old, boy, girl. So when the second set was born, we had 4 children that were 2.5 and younger. And so those were tough days. So many answers here. The first is, it would be completely impossible if my wife was not a stay-at-home mom. So all credit truly goes to her, because she, like, you mentioned very kindly a lot of things that I'm doing. She works like 5 times harder than I do, but she stays at home with the kids. We also have, when the new set was almost here, we welcomed a young woman from Germany to come live with us. So we have an au pair. So we have somebody that lives with us full time, because we actually, weirdly, in our church, there is somebody else that has 2 sets of twins that are the same distance in age. They're a little bit older, but they're the same distance in age. Yeah. And so we crawled to their feet and we're like, please tell us how to do this. They're like, listen, it'll be fine. We went out to dinner and they're like, you have to get help, because you cannot get 4 children that need to be put in car seats. You cannot get them into the car or out of the car at Target. You just can't do that as one adult. And so they very smartly turned us on to the au pair program, which is like a state, a federal level program. And so this person came over, she lives with us, like we, pay for her. She's basically like the sister that's like 10 years younger than us. Just an absolutely amazing, wonderful helper. She is incredibly good at her job. So that's another big thing. The other thing that I'm never shy about talking about is that I work a whole lot. And so like, I don't ever want to give off the impression that like life is easy breezy, and if your life is not easy breezy, you're doing it wrong, because life is very difficult for me. It is very, very difficult. There are a few things that I don't compromise on. Like I always leave. This is my office. I always leave here in time to be home for bedtime with the kids. Like it's just something I don't miss, because I'm not going to sacrifice like their childhood for my whatever open source dreams or whatever, right? And so like for example, last night or yesterday, I left here at 6:15, went home, played with the kids, put all the kids down, had dinner, and then after that, like I got back on my computer. And I don't like, it's not prescriptive, because I don't think that like that is necessarily the best way to live forever. But this is a phase in my life right now. Yeah. This is a phase. There are a lot of things I want to do professionally, and there are things that I want to do on the family front. And so I don't watch sports. I don't play video games. I rarely ever exercise. And so like, I'm not a beacon of like having it all. I'm a beacon of deciding what few things I want, and then trying to optimize for that and eliminate the rest. And at some point, I would love to have like this carefree, easygoing, play video games, watch a bunch of new, Severance or whatever. But that's just not the phase of life that I'm at. And so I've made certain decisions, and also it is difficult. There's just no two ways about it. It is very difficult.
All right. Thanks for being transparent about that. And like, it's so easy to be online and to try and make it seem like everything is easy, and you're just breezing through, and you're just like, whatever, I just put together this project, I just put together this course, and that was, it's easy, but it's hard work.
It's not.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I want that to be clear. Like I wrote a year in review post.
Just want to mention it actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was year in review 2024. And basically the gist was like, this was the hardest year of my life. And there were many, many times after putting the kids down, I sat at the top of the stairs and just cried, because I was like so freaking stressed out, because I got laid off in March. Like we started a company, yes, but it was because Steve and I both got laid off. So I've got 4 kids at home. I've got, including the au pair, 7 mouths to feed. I got laid off, and it's like, I also got rheumatoid arthritis, and I have type 1 diabetes, and like, I just sat and cried. Like it's hard. It is just hard. But my hope is I can at least be some sort of encouragement that like, even when things are hard, you can keep going. And that is the hope. Not that it will be easy, but that it is possible.
Yeah. I don't know what else to say to that. I think this is like, this is such a good summary. And also like, it's just brutal honesty as well. Plus, what you just mentioned, you didn't, and what you mentioned earlier, you didn't become like a cynical, snarky internet person. No, it's quite the opposite. So yeah, I hope that like this at least gives a little bit of inspiration to the people out there listening. Aaron, I have one last question. Where can people follow you? Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on x.com, which is a ridiculous name. You can find me on Twitter at Aaron D. Francis, D as in Daniel. I'm also on Blue Sky as aaronfrancis.com. And as you mentioned briefly, we have a podcast, Mostly Technical, which is a generous name. It's barely technical, but it is a lot of fun. So you can find that at mostlytechnical.com.
Perfect. Of course, all the links as usual in the show notes / description if you're watching on YouTube. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time, coming here to the show and talking with us about Fusion, Vue, Laravel, live. And I hope this won't be the last time. We'll see you either here or maybe in real life, maybe at some conference.
That would be awesome. 100%. Yes, thank you both so much for having me. Thank you for welcoming a Vue outsider, but a big fan of Vue. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're a lot of things, but you're surely not a Vue outsider. Definitely.
That's very kind of you.
Of course. We're curious how to see how Fusion will go. And then latest, we will come here for another update on it. Perfect. Until then, take a look at the older shows, the older episodes as well. Of course, the linked one with Inertia. If you have still no idea what Inertia is, check it out. Joe's explained that phenomenally. If this is not the latest DejaVue episode, then just keep listening and see you in the next one. Bye, folks.